Good afternoon and welcome to Airmic's third in the series of 4 webinars based on the results of our survey project, A Profession in Transformation. My name is Kim Lee and I'm Research and Development Manager here at Airmic, and I will be setting the theme for today's webinar. Last week's webinar reviewed the results of one of our deep dive reports entitled, Is the Insurance Market Fit for the Future? This paper forms one of 4 deep dive survey-driven reports that we've developed to further understand the facets that are transforming the risk landscape and the roles and responsibilities of our members. Up on your screens now is a roundup of the key results from the webinar. To find out more, you can download the full report entitled, Is the Insurance Market Fit for the Future, from the Airmic website. This report reviews the insurance market's response to some of the key challenges that our members are facing in a very fast evolving and complex risk environment. One of the key risks highlighted in this report is intangible risks, most predominantly reputational damage, of which there are few insurance products to cover reputational risk, and this report looks at some of the ways that our members are dealing with that challenge and how the insurance market can support them. Today's webinar will look at another element of transformation, the digital future, and I'm pleased to welcome our presenter, Kyle Bryant, who is Regional Manager, Cyber Risk Europe at Chubb. Kyle will talk us through the key survey results from our digital transformation deep dive report, the main risks that are keeping risk managers awake at night, as well as looking at the cyber insurance risk landscape. Before I hand over to Kyle, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. As ever with our webinars, this is an interactive seminar, and you're all invited to take part in the discussion by asking questions anytime throughout the course of today's presentation. Now, you can do that via your GoToWebinar control panel, which is located to the right of your screen and looks like this image in front of your screen just now. If you can't see your GoToWebinar control panel, just look out for the orange arrow, which is usually located to the right of your screen. Click on that, and that should review the control panel. So to ask a question, scroll down to the Questions tab, type your question in the allocated box, and then click Send Privately. I will then post all your questions to Kyle at the end of the presentation. Lastly, you can download the slides and our deep dive report from the Handout tab from your control panel. That's all for me for now. Kyle, it's over to you.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having us, and thanks for allowing Chubb to be involved in this process. I think the survey is has some valuable outputs which we're going to discuss today. But I think it's important for us first to set the scene. Cybercrime is now estimated to cost between 400 and 500 billion per year, depending on which report you read. Up to 4 billion personal records were stolen in 2016. The news you read every day, there's a new breach here, a new incident there, a system outage, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the risk is only expected to climb over the next few years. And when you look at this as someone who manages risk or even underwrites it, I think your first tendency is to say, well, why don't we just unplug everything? But the reality is the digital transformation is here to stay. It has significant advantages for companies, both in efficiencies and scales and changing business models. And it's a necessary development. And for us as a profession to stay on top of it, I think we do have to evolve. And insurance as well has to evolve to stay relevant in the new reality. So before we get into the study, I think it's important for us to talk about or establish what we're talking about when we speak of digital transformation. The first thing I want to look at is what I call going mobile, and how that has changed what we do and how we operate as companies. Going mobile, it means that we're breaking down the old wall barriers, right? Where we're able to communicate to both our clients and our customers and our employees despite locations, despite time zones. It makes communication immediate. It creates new access to talent pools where organizations may have been restricted by that in the past. It allows us to offer things like flexible work schedules to keep people plugged in when they're away. And mobile, of course, gives us access to customers and new avenues for revenue development. If you look at insurance, for instance, you now can buy your travel insurance on your way to the airport. You know, it's changing how we do business. The biggest problem with that, though, is that every time, for instance, you create an app or create a new technology, it creates new risk. Particularly if you are in touch with their personal devices, that's a treasure trove of personal information. You need to be careful about what type of information you're collecting and how you manage that information. And that leads us to the second point, power of data. You know, data is the new currency, unfortunately. I always like this, the example of the self-service kiosks. Mm-hmm. You know, everyone can relate to that. And if you're in the mid-90s, you started to see one or two, you know, at your supermarkets. But over time, that data that was being collected showed that the cost of labor was much higher than the risk of theft. That people were much more honest than maybe originally anticipated. And that's only expanded. Now I don't think you can walk into any supermarket without having just as many, if not more, self-checkouts than you do personal checkouts. You know, and that data really does change business models. Another thing that's changed business models is cloud computing. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this. There is a complete webinar on cloud computing on Airmic's YouTube page, as well as a website that I did just a few months ago. You know, sorry for the shameless plug there, but you know, cloud computing is something that's part of every organization. Whether or not a company has a cloud computing risk management plan or a vendor management plan already in place, the fact is that employees are bringing cloud systems to their environment and oftentimes using web-based technologies in their everyday work. And lastly, the hottest topic of the moment, I think where there's the most conversation around is around new technologies. And for this, we're talking about Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and these are extremely big questions. The ethical question around driving cars to me is fascinating. You know, the question of whether or not you know, a self-driving car makes a decision in an inevitable accident to divert to hit one party over another, to cause injury to one over another. That's a moral conundrum that I don't think you know, we've fully realized yet, and how we're going to address it as a business going forward. And that does take into account both, I think, risk management as well as insurance. If technology is leading the way, we do need to respond. So we talked about digital transformation, and I think it's important now to see how insurance and risk management is responding. The Airmic survey told its members to determine just where they see the risk today and where they'll see it in the future. You know, while traditional risks like BI, reputation, which you mentioned earlier, sort of remain the two on top of the mind, two of the fastest growing risks were from new technologies and new business models created by new technology. Now, the numbers are clearly low. I think that's important to point out because it does tell us something. It says that when we see the risk may not be clear. We may not have seen the impact of that risk yet, but that it's clear that it's expected to grow. So I think there's an underlying fear there that risk managers see that this is something I don't know about, but I feel it, I see it, or I'm reading about it, but I'm not seeing the results of it at the moment. Now to contrast that, you look at the capabilities and resources to manage those exposures. So you're thinking again back that there may be underlying fear and there may be some concern about them. At present, the capabilities and resources that companies have, or respondents in the survey have, to address that exposure is pretty low. Only in this instance, you know, the only net negative in the entire survey, negative 3%, respondents were satisfied with the ability to manage this risk. And, you know, and only 9% on new technology, and that's marginally better, but it's still in single digits. pretty bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, turning to specific cyber risks in the survey, this is one that jumped out for me, and I spoke some time about it at Airmic during our presentation. Out of the top 5 top of mind risks for risk managers in the survey, business interruption arising from cyber risk, as well as personal data loss, were 2 of the top 5. Now, I think that's consistent with what we see when we're out talking to risk managers today, and we're talking to insurance purchasers today. But you can also argue that two additional ones in the top 5, changes in legislation and regulation, as well as loss of reputational and brand value, are also cyber risk related or digital risk related. I can't tell you the number of conversations we've had over the past year where a risk manager comes to us and says, I need a solution for reputational damage. I need a solution that is future-proof to regulations, because the regulatory environment is changing rapidly. And we're going to touch on the landscape in just a moment. But you know, from looking at brand reputation, I do want to spend a second on that because you mentioned that at the top.
Yes.
We recognize it. I mean, the change in online media, how individuals engage with media, has changed the reputational impact as well. Because now, if you have one incident in London, it's not just an incident in London anymore. They're reading about it in Hong Kong via Twitter or online 2 or 3 minutes after it happened. The scope of crises can be extremely spread depending on the severity. And you need to have not only an insurance response, but also a crisis response built to that. So let's look at the reality of it. Is it reasonable to think for risk managers to think that these are top-of-mind risks? Well, just the recent past, and I didn't even enter. You see, the first one was the WannaCry ransomware event. But since we gave the presentation at Airmic, the Petya ransomware occurred as well. Back to back, both using vulnerabilities that existed in current operating systems. Then you have system failures that have existed. You've seen them in airports and transit hubs that have made the news. We've seen the SWIFT fraud cases in Bangladesh that made the news last year. The Panama Papers, a different type of event, completely, where it's corporate non-public information, where it's information that is certainly not intended to be public is published, solely for the purpose of damaging reputation of those individuals and companies. You've seen U.S.-French election hacking, so ideological-based attacks, political motivations that have changed the landscape. And then you have these zombie DDoS attacks, where webcams and television boxes and things that we typically think are benign are used as channels to attack third parties, that are used to be vulnerable, and that is that is something that I think that's the first probably real incident of Internet of Things, a wide-scale Internet of Things type of attack.
So I guess, Carl, in this sort of new landscape, it will be fair to conclude that cyber risk is all pervading.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course. I think that's for sure. There's this obvious thing. I like to say this is what we know exists, and this is what we think is coming. But then there's, of course, the unknown that we can't predict or know at the moment, which is where I think we have to do a lot of work in insurance to stay relevant and stay on top of things. And the minute we see something that may not be covered or adequately addressed in the insurance market, that we try to find a solution for it. And it may not be a risk transfer solution, but it may be an incident response solution. Giving you an example there, is that one of the first things we realized when ransomware came about was that the ability to pay Bitcoin wasn't as efficient as it was needed. So a incident would occur, and you may not have a vendor that could execute in Bitcoin or pay a ransom in Bitcoin because it took 24 hours to open a Bitcoin account.
Yeah.
So it meant finding a vendor or making sure that we did have a vendor on a panel that would be available to respond and pay the Bitcoin on behalf of the insured, whether or not that was insurable. Right, and that's one of those things where I say it's every year it's going to continue to evolve, and you've got to continue to be reactive to it. I think next it's important to look at what we know is coming. This is sort of what we know, right? The GDPR, of course, the EU General Data Protection Regulation, is something that is on the constant minds. At Airmic, we talked about it numerous times. I think everyone wants to sort of measure where others are at. And important note here, if you look down at the asterisk at the bottom, is that 73% of the respondents from the survey said their company currently fulfills GDPR requirements or will in 3 years. And that makes me, as an underwriter, feel really good because I still think there's a lot of things in the GDPR that need refining or defining in some instances. So it feels pretty good to have companies that are confident in making that statement, even if it's in an anonymous survey. I think it's worthwhile, right? Data transfer rules. This is something that's been growing in conversations with our large global companies, where deciding whether or not to go with binding corporate rules or going with manual clauses in contracts. It's a bit of a process. I think the lawyers are happy that this is providing them some business, but at the same time, it's something that the companies are worried about, because the data transfer environment, the regulations around it, are only growing more and more complex. There is rising political and ideological tension as well. We mentioned the election hackings that occurred previously, or supposed election hackings to some, I think. But there is this rising political and ideological tension, and I think digital technologies makes it easier for them to execute. And that brings me to the last point: is that digital currencies and the dark web influences are creating an environment that is conducive to criminal behavior. It makes it easy for them to operate from the shadows and execute in a highly effective manner. And if you use WannaCry as an example, it probably wasn't the most efficient attack, but at the same time, it was easy to execute for them, and it was non-discriminatory. So it found as many victims as it did. So with this in mind, I think we've settled that there is the risk here. I think we've spent a lot of time there, but the fact is the risk exists. Let's turn to the survey and see how risk managers view their ability to manage them. We're going to start with the bad here. I usually don't like starting with the bad, but I think it's worthwhile if we can close this more on a better and a good note. First, the bad, that only 42% of risk managers identify cyber risk as a core responsibility. Now, this drove the conversation at Airmic. Every conversation I had with risk managers this year saw this point in the survey and said, well, there's a reason for this. It's that organizations are built 5 different ways. The risk management profession doesn't mean the same in each company. Risk managers' roles remain undefined across the industry, and may be inconsistent because of place in the organization. Risk managers are also going to have different levels of influence, and traditional silos still remain. And I think that's going to inform the rest of the answers here. Because when I first looked at this, I thought, oh, come on, how do you not see this as a core responsibility? You identify it as so much risk in the a 44-year organization. But when you take it in that construct and say, well, okay, there's some diversity in how risk management is positioned in the organization, I think you should then start to make sense of this, because only 27% of the respondents were happy with their current ability to respond to cyber losses. I think if you ask your IT department, they probably feel differently. They probably would say it's much, much higher than that. Only 32% of respondents will regularly collaborate with their technology teams. Well, I think those two go together now, right? You see that the core responsibility may exist for the technology teams, and the risk management department may not know it. They may not know how comfortable it is because they're not collaborating enough. And as an underwriter, I'll tell you that is one thing that does worry me. And particularly compounded with this last bullet here, where only 51% of respondents, or 51% of respondents see no change in their relationship in the next 3 years. We see technology as the fastest growing risk. Digital transformation is going to create increased exposure. Yet only half of risk management employees that responded to the survey see their relationship changing. And I think as insurers, and I think it's my role, and I think a broker's role, one of our key responsibilities is making sure we do try to break down the silo. because we're only going to get as good of an insurance outcome as we can by engaging the right people. So you got to bring those stakeholders in, and I think there's actually a little takeaway box that's in the report that says, you know, here's the things you can do. But bringing those stakeholders to the table creates a better outcome. It's a better conversation, and it really starts to bridge the gap. It's why you see a lot of insurance companies now investing in sort of the risk engineering approach, which I'll talk about in a second about the insurance response. But those silos need to be broken down. There has to be communication. You have to increase the level of influence risk management has in an organization in order to address these exposures. But let's say that. Let's focus on the good for a second. This is extremely comforting coming out of this. And I think if you saw this same survey 3 years ago, it would have been interesting if we had the same thing, because I imagine these numbers would have been much lower. You know, because 68% do agree that cyber risk is managed as an enterprise risk. While it may not be their core responsibility, they feel that there must be enough collaboration at the C-suite or amongst the organization to say it is an enterprise risk or managed as an enterprise risk. 65% agree there's a clear cyber risk governance framework. For large organizations, that is an extremely tough task. You know, I talked to a large company that had, you know, over 300 different local subsidiaries in countries worldwide. I can't imagine a cyber risk governance framework, you know, the energy it must take to create that and how to implement it effectively. So it's pretty comforting that 65% feel that way. 64% said that cyber risks have been identified and quantified. And I tell you, this is something where I think even the insurance industry struggles with. So to see a 64% number there from that they're confident that they've quantified that exposure gives me some good feeling that, you know, when risks are coming to us, particularly in a global account and large account environment, that they've done their homework. And then the last one, well, it's only 54%, but I put this as a positive because, you know, agree that third-party cyber risks are being managed. You know, I'll go back to the cloud webinar we did before. Third-party cyber risk is here to stay. It's only growing. Having a risk manager that can insert themselves in the vendor management process, whether it be by creating guidelines to assess or a questionnaire to assess vendors, or whether it means actually get involved in vendor by vendor management. I think it's important, knowing who has access to your organization's IT network, knowing how the individuals are, or the logins are managed and removed if someone leaves the company or is no longer servicing, knowing when, you know, when vendors are into your system or using your IT system or on site. Those should all be part of risk management. And lastly, I think, you know, this is sort of comes all together at the end, that, you know, one of the ways that you can ultimately try to take out or make the rest of take the rest of the risk away is to purchase insurance. And the biggest positive to me out of this, I stuck onto it immediately. This is the first survey I've seen of risk managers where more than half plan to transfer cyber risk. And that gives me great confidence for the first time that, you know, despite the other criticisms and hearing many cited a lack of appropriate, cost-effective risk transfer options as a reason for their dissatisfaction, it feels good that we're building some credibility. That what we've done, what we've invested in over the past few years in the market, have started to show value at the client level. And we're responding. I think I'll close with this, and I think it's something I do want to stress, and this is why I tell risk managers to stick with us, engage with us, challenge us. Because what's happened over the past few years is we have seen the insurance market. The capacity has increased. Pricing has come down. Coverage and services have expanded. So it sounds like a pretty optimistic time to buy, you know, a pretty great time to buy cyber insurance. We've seen solutions for large companies respond to clients' requests for property damage and bodily injury coverage. We've seen risk engineering and loss control help clients benchmark, analyze, and help them prevent future losses. And then we've seen as well incident response become more relevant for multinational companies, making sure they're moved not only in local country, but in local language, with local responders if necessary. And I think, and all of this being backed by traditional risk transfer is important. It can be a compelling proposition. I think for large accounts, again, I'll go back to this, is preparation before approaching the risk market, the insurance market is key, to make sure that you get the most relevant product out. I always say to my underwriters, let's make sure that what we're offering is relevant and meaningful to the client. So making sure you're digging through sort of the noise that can be created by the submission proposal process to truly engage with the client to create a partnership. With that, I'll open it up to questions.
We do have a few questions stacked up here. Quite a few around the 42% figure. 42% of respondents see cyber risk as a core responsibility. But at the same time, less than half, so that's less than half, sorry. But then we've got the 68% who say that cyber is managed as an enterprise risk. So it doesn't appear as though the two correlate. Right. Now, how would you explain that? And I'm wondering how much of that is further evidence that cyber is predominantly a technology department risk.
Yeah, there's two things I'll say there. Is one, I think I'll go back to the fact that the respondents to the survey, risk managers are going to be sitting in different levels of the organization. Some are more focused on traditional risk transfer, and they're focused on insurance purchasing. So the enterprise risk management function may sit in a different department itself. And that's before you even get to maybe IT or digital, or digital risk management, which may fall to the information security or information technology department. I think the other thing there is just the terminology. I think when it comes to enterprise risk management, in a lot of entities, a lot of companies, you'll see that analyzed as sort of a data exercise. Like what is the type of event that's going to cause us the biggest impact, right? And so it's a data exercise that makes it in its own function. We see a lot of large companies moving that way.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have those two dynamics that work together here to create what I think is a key separation in sort of the response. And
I guess collaboration sort of makes one part of the answer here. And just going back to that figure, 51% see that their relationship with the technology department will change. But given that cyber is one of the top risks, should that figure be higher? Yeah,
it's just, that's why I pointed it out. I think it should be much, much higher. I would be bold to say it should be 100%. I'll tell you this, as a cyber risk underwriter who has no risk management function for the organization other than to make sure that I don't create risk, I have more interaction with our IT department than ever. Every employee does. Whether it be what they're training me on, or whether they're requiring me to run through a training on this or that, or whether it's sharing threat intelligence information. These types of things have increased, taking out my role as an underwriter. It's just what's happening. And I think the resources are often available, and it's up to the individual, whether it be the risk manager or the IT department, to start breaking those down to create that collaboration. And I think it's inevitable. I actually think the 51% that responded positively there may be more of an indication of those who are actively doing it versus not.
And Kyle, I'm just conscious of time. I do want to squeeze in a couple more questions.
Sure.
So there's one about third-party cyber risk, and we've got 54% agreeing that third-party cyber risk is well managed. But how easy is it really to manage someone else's cyber risk?
Yeah, it's not easy. It's certainly not easy. Most of the most severe types of attacks happen through an authorized user or an authorized IT system. And if you look at them, they do create unique areas to manage. The fact is that it is not the easiest thing to do in a traditional structure. What we encourage our clients to do is to focus on the things they can control in a traditional way and not to upset boundaries that are already in the company. No one's saying you need to go and question what your IT or vendor management is doing currently, but there are ways to improve process. There are ways to make sure that in an incident, that's caused by a third party, do you have the ability to investigate? Do you have the ability, if they're holding data on your behalf, to gather that data and bring it back? Do you simply have a plan in place to cut that vendor off or mitigate that third-party damage and bring someone on so you don't have an ongoing business interruption or any follow-on events? And having that sort of plan in place, that life cycle management for all those third-party vendors is truly important. I think it's a necessary part of risk management going forward.
Carl, I am going to squeeze one more question in. This is an insurance question, and it relates to this slide actually on the screen now. So we've got 52% of our respondents say they plan to transfer cyber risk to the insurance market. But well and truly, as objectively as you can, is the insurance market ready to take on these cyber risks? Yes,
absolutely. I can say that with confidence now more than ever. I think a few years ago, if you'd asked me that, where the largest insurance tower was probably 300 million, there wasn't enough penetration in the market worldwide to create scale. I think that a single event could be there. But nowadays, the insurance market is mature enough, and the reinsurance market is mature enough to spread the risk and take on quite a bit. I don't see a situation that would be taking out the entire insurance market. But again, I think there is a lot of work to do, and particularly as we work across other lines of business that may pick up cyber risk. But there is a commitment, clear commitment by the insurance market to respond. And I think for any company that is interested, you can find a solution if you engage at the right level.
Great. Kyle, thank you very much indeed. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. Now, this webinar will be available on the Airmic website, and the address is on your screen now. You can also download our deep dive report, which is entitled Digital Transformation, from the Airmic website. To do that from the Airmic website, and of course from the GoToWebinar control panel. The next webinar, our last in the series, will look at the topic of measuring the value of risk and insurance management. Now that will be presented by Hamish Roberts and Adrian Donald from JLT. If you haven't registered for that webinar, you can do so by clicking or following the link on your screen. Thank you once again for joining us for today's webinar, and I hope you found it useful. Please join us next week.